Welcome everybody to the online debate on exposing and opposing extremist neo-Nazi groups and experiences of journalists and civil society with regard to that. We are honored to host distinguished and knowledgeable speakers on this subject. We will have discussion with them for around 45 minutes or so, and then we will open the floor for questions. I kindly ask members of the audience to remain muted during the discussion, but if possible, to keep their camera working in order for us to have more human feeling to whom we are speaking. If you would rather post your questions in written, you may use chat section. My colleague from the Peace Institute, Jasna Babic, will help us as a host to go through the meeting smoothly. So our today's speakers come from 3 countries, Slovenia, Serbia, and Germany, and have experience in disclosing and countering extremist, racist, anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi groups. Talya Feldman is a time-based media artist from Denver, Colorado. She received the 2021 Dutch Art Award for her installation, "The Violence We Have Witnessed Carries a Weight on Our Hearts." The picture of that is instead of her picture on our invitation letter, which you probably received. And this installation is at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. As a survivor of the racist and anti-Semitic attack in Halle, Germany, on 9th October 2019, Talya has received global recognition for her collaborative work with the activist network NSU-Watch and her subsequent projects combating racism and anti-Semitism on and offline. Erik Valenčič is an independent journalist and correspondent from the Middle East and Africa and a filmmaker. He has made several award-winning documentaries, including The Coalition of Hatred, Koalicija Sovraštva in 2014, which dealt with the neo-Nazi and racist groups in Slovenia, and was awarded by CIRCOM, this is Association of Regional Televisions, in 2015. Recently, this year, he published an investigative article, The Coalition of Hatred 2, presenting new findings about neo-Nazi groups in Slovenia and their relations with the ruling political party. And our third guest is Darko Šper, editor in the news desk at Radio Television Vojvodina in Serbia, editor of the fact-checking section on the portal Voice, and daily editor on the portal Autonomia. In 2015, he received the European Union Award for Investigative Journalism in Serbia for a series of articles on the activities of neo-Nazis in Serbia. He is a member of the board of the Independent Association of Journalists in Vojvodina and work on many projects of this association, and is also a trade unionist in a journalistic community in Serbia. So our online debate is part of the project Defending Watchdog Role of Civil Society and Journalists in Slovenia. We collaborate in this project, Peace Institute, Slovenia Association of Journalists, and investigative portal Počrto, and which is also good to disclose. The project is supported by the network of European foundations under the Civitates program. So what is the point of today's discussion? We can follow across Europe a rise of these far-right extremist groups and their violence. I would like to remind that the European Parliament adopted in 2018 a resolution expressing concern by the increasing normalization of fascism, racism, and xenophobia, and they also called on EU member states to ban neo-Nazi groups. In this resolution, the Parliament also argued that the impunity enjoined by far-right organizations in some member states is one of the reasons behind the rise in violent actions, affecting society as a whole and targeting particularly minorities such as Black Europeans, people of African descent, Jews, Muslims, Roma, non-EU nationals, LGBT people, and persons with disabilities. The resolution also raised concerns regarding collusion between political leaders, political parties, and law enforcement with neo-fascist and neo-Nazis groups in some member states. So we will start our discussion with the first set of questions to our speakers like this. What do we know about the activities of these groups in Slovenia, Germany, Serbia, other European countries worldwide? So what our speakers can share with us, what they learned from their work on disclosing these groups, who these groups are, how they operate, how they recruit members, how and to what extent are the members of neo-Nazi groups from different countries connected to each other, what the internet, what kind of role plays internet in this, and what are the connections of these groups with political parties, what influenced the rise of these groups, and how do you, our guest speakers, work on disclosing them? I suggest to start with Talya Feldman and her experience with this.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes, we do. Erik, maybe you should mute, or from somewhere we hear some sound. Talya, please continue.
So for myself, I should say that a lot of my investigation and work began shortly after the attack in Halle. So the attack in Halle was a racist and anti-Semitic attack that was carried out by a white supremacist who was primarily radicalized online and was inspired by attacks that were happening globally that we have been seeing in recent years, both locally and globally, in Christchurch, in Poway, in El Paso, in Oslo. And after the attack, it was important for me to understand the context and to understand how something like this, of course, could have happened. And in looking at a number, or reaching out, I should say, to a number of think tanks like Data and Society, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London, who track a lot of extremism online, who do a lot of research into misinformation and work with reporters to combat right-wing narratives from infiltrating into mainstream media. It was very evident that the German government and the politicians, but also the court and the investigators into the attack in Halle were unwilling to recognize the connections and the context of this attack in Halle to so many others that we have been seeing around the world. And which for me, of course, felt very dangerous, because if you are not able to see the context of these attacks, to recognize the connections that a number of these players have to one another across the world, then how are we able to then end that violence from continuing again and again and again? And so from my position as an artist, working with a number of other artists and researchers, we built with some open source technology from forensic architecture, a visual timeline time map that goes through exactly what happened in Halle, specifically online and offline, but also looking at it more in context globally, the connections of this attack to so many others in Germany and outside of Germany, the connections of even strategy of language in terms of anti-Semitic and racist rhetoric and imagery that's passed, and doing so in order to really take control of that narrative and combat that narrative as well. So that was really the beginning of my deep dive out of urgency for survival, of course. And since then, I have been working very closely with NSU-Watch, which you mentioned is an activist network based here in Germany, who do track a number of neo-Nazi networks in Germany and outside of Germany. and also continuing to work with Data and Society in New York and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue as well, in thinking how visually we can combat these narratives.
When you say tracking, and I saw also that not only you, but also other survivors of the Halle attack organized in this way, what does it mean, tracking, and what do you do with the disclosed facts, who these people are, what they do? Do you publish them, or what do you do with that?
Yeah, so it's all published. I think one of the biggest narratives that I imagine we are all facing is this narrative of the lone wolf, the single perpetrator. And that's something that I know many of us are combating also in the United States. This idea that all of these attacks that we've been seeing in recent years are conducted by single individuals. And especially when you're looking at online radicalization, that is a narrative that's very easy to reinforce because of the anonymity of the internet. When in fact the connections and the communities and the networks are there. So in exposing that misinformation, that harmful narrative that refuses to, again, look in context, to zoom out, recognize these perpetrators in these attacks not as single instances of violence, but as instances of violence connected over even decades, is important. And so we approached it, myself and another survivor from the attack in Halle specifically, we approached that visually through language and through this web platform that we built that you can see. The URL is halle.nsu-watch.info. And when you go to the site, what it offers is a look at the online and offline activity of the Halle attack in particular, but also a much more broader understanding of what online radicalization is by connecting to a number of research reports, a number of analysis, connecting the different moments, even in Germany specifically, connecting even to the NSU, the National Socialist Underground Network, and then also looking globally again at Oslo, Poway, El Paso, and Christchurch, and the connections, the very evident connections there.
You explore and disclose these connections. Do you see also in Germany, as Darko and Erik will talk about it for Serbia and Slovenia, connections of these groups, as the European Parliament also mentioned in the resolution, with some political leaders, political parties, or even law enforcement like police, prosecutors, courts?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think in looking at online radicalization specifically, one of the benefits that a lot of right-wing narratives and neo-Nazi players have is that in the anonymity of the internet, they are able to then inspire and motivate acts of violence. And then when those single people take up that gun, they can then distance themselves and say, well, they never were in our party, they never were a member of our right-wing party or our movement, therefore we're not responsible for this act of violence. But in fact, they are very much responsible for that act of violence in the language that they're using, the narratives that they're pushing online through the different platforms. And that is something that I do believe, and that is something that we as survivors from Halle did take on was this responsibility of civil society in fighting that, in saying that, yes, there is responsibility and accountability, and that needs to be addressed. So, and that can look and be in many different forms. It can be looking at the platforms themselves and the responsibility of the platforms and the dissemination of this hate. It's also looking at the various players and the language that they use in politics, in government, in law enforcement, the systems of racism and anti-Semitism that exist and that have existed long before the internet and will exist, unfortunately, long after the internet. And so really, again, zooming out, recognizing the context, creating those connections visually and clearly for individuals in society to be able to say that everything is connected and we need to do something about that.
Thank you, Talya. We will come back to you. Let's now listen about Slovenia and Erik experience. What do we know about these groups in Slovenia? How they recruit members, how they use internet, how they are connected to others and to the political parties in our own country or law enforcement. Erik, please. Microphone.
Can you hear me now? Hopefully you do. Okay. So regarding the first question, which is what do we know about the activities of far-right racist neo-Nazi groups here in Slovenia? Well, the thing is, we know a lot. The problem is that we are only a few people who know a lot. And I think that many information that we, most of us are freelance journalists who give out to the public is not then followed by the mainstream media. There is not really a general debate about what is happening here in Slovenia. I don't want to be too specific in my first answer, but we'll get onto it later on, I hope. I want to tell you, I will tell you briefly like this. So for example, I've been investigating the activities, the organization, the international connections or connections to the domestic political parties of the Slovenian extreme right-wing groups or neo-Nazi groups since 2008. At that time, I worked for a newspaper, Mladina, which I still cooperate with. And at Mladina, we received numerous reports of violence or harassment being directed against students, leftist activists, LGBT community, civil society representatives, and we looked into it, what is going on. So 2 years after that, 2010, I published my first extensive article, which in English translation would be the Coalition of Hatred or the Coalition of Hate. Now, I coined this term in 2010, and it became kind of well-known, recognized here in Slovenia. It still is. But I would like to make a point about this term. In April 2010, when I first coined it, when I first used it in an article, the Coalition of Hate basically described, represented a loose alliance among far-right groups, racist groups, homophobic groups, ultranationalist groups, and of course, neo-Nazi groups. This was in 2010. When we talk about Coalition of Hate today in the year of 2021, the Coalition of Hate refers to cooperation, literal cooperation among particularly neo-Nazi groups and the governing party of SDS. And we can go into details a bit later, but I want to point out that what's happening at the moment here in Slovenia, and it is a process, and we didn't get to this just by accident. For over years and years and years, the leading figures of the SDS party, including, of course, or on top of this pyramid, Janez Janša, they embraced neo-Nazi conspiracy theories like cultural Marxism, like the Great Replacement theory. They are constantly, they turned it into a campaign of hate in order to recruit and legitimize far-right groups and neo-Nazi groups. Based on all the evidence, all the information, the network of my sources that I've developed throughout the years, everything points to this. So now we have here in Slovenia neo-Nazi groups who are legitimized and legalized to the extent that the Ministry of Culture, which is in the hands of the SDS, actually gave a special status of an NGO in the field of culture and in public interest. It's a special status. It was given this year to a neo-Nazi organization that goes by the name Association for Promotion of Traditional Values. The traditional values that these people are promoting are the core European, let's say, values that we should be greatly ashamed forever. We are talking about values like the Holocaust, like gas chambers and soap made out of human remains. And despite all the uncoverings, despite of a couple of us journalists and dedicated people who got the information out, who clearly showed that these people are neo-Nazis, and the very fact that one of them was even celebrating Hitler openly on Twitter, this did not, of course, lead to this association losing its status. One of the most important things that are happening now in Slovenia is that important for the neo-Nazis and important for us that we understand what is going on is that neo-Nazis are actually building media platforms. They have media platforms that openly and freely disseminate the hatred, the conspiracy theories, all of which is being supported and by SDS in different ways. Now, SDS owns or co-owns also some media on its own as a political party, and it incorporates, this media incorporate neo-Nazis into their ranks. And I will give you just one example, one very shameful example. So you have one of the main neo-Nazis here in Slovenia goes by the name of Andrej Sekulović. And he's working for a weekly, for a magazine co-owned by the SDS party. The title of the name of the weekly is very Orwellian. The name of the weekly is Democracy. So for this newspaper, for this weekly, neo-Nazi Sekulović did last year an interview with Laura Towler, who is a white supremacist and a far-right activist from Great Britain. In this interview, you can read that apparently, according to them, one of the biggest problems that Great Britain is facing is, and I almost quote from memory, one of the biggest problems, according to them, is that there are too many Jews in the government and in the leading social positions in Great Britain, and that these Jews are advocating open borders. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because SDS party has the entire interview published on its webpage since September last year. They do not have a link to the interview, they have the entire interview. So you see, this is what we are dealing with here in Slovenia. And I don't want to talk just about how neo-Nazis are bad, how far-right extremism and terrorism is a serious and significant threat to us all. I want to talk also about the inactivities of the political left-wing parties and of the incompetence, sometimes I would say, of the civil society in Slovenia as well, because we need to address issues on our side as well. But I'm hoping to do that a bit later.
Yes, I just wanted, Erik, to ask you about these ongoing media activities, even open, as you said, and connected to the ruling party and ruling our government, which is at the moment presiding the whole European Union. Having this in mind, let us just talk also about the violence, physical violence, in comparison with what Talya experienced, and the fact that maybe in Slovenia, citizens are not so much aware of it until this kind of violence appear openly. And we experienced in recent period these groups appearing on the streets at the time of anti-government protests of human rights activists, democracy defenders, and so on. It was on the edge of violent conflict or their attack. And the fact that at one moment, when it was a great threat of such an violent accident, the police intervened and removed this neo-Nazi group from the square. What was the consequence? Later on, these the police heads of police initiated investigation, blaming the police on the ground for not acting properly because they removed this group. So what is actually, from your knowledge, really a real threat of violence and of this group gaining support from such instances? Do we face such threat?
I would like to say first that you mentioned before earlier in our presentation that I did a documentary, a TV documentary called Coalition of Hate. As you all can see, I like this term and I stick to it. In Coalition of Hate, we showed 163 intimate photographs of the neo-Nazis, photographs that we got by different methods that we were gathering through time. Now, we showed two of the photographs shown in the documentary were before and after photos. It was a photo of a pipe bomb being manufactured, and then the next photo was the same pipe bomb that was tested. They tested it. They blew it up somewhere. Now, what happened after we showed this on public television? Nothing. Nothing happened. Nothing at all. There have been violent attacks in recent years. The situation is by no means as bad as it is in Hungary, Serbia, Croatia to some extent, Great Britain, Poland, and etc., etc. But I never want to be in a position in which I would say, look, we told you so. There are a couple of dozen, or I keep files on about 100 neo-Nazis and their closest sympathizers. Now, the number doesn't seem like a large number, but you have to keep in mind that Anders Breivik was only one person. And it is possible that something could happen here in Slovenia. It is possible. I know these people psychologically, and I suspect that some of them are capable of carrying out a very violent terrorist-like attacks. Now, they were being used, according to my information, my sources and basically evidence that I have. They've been used neo-Nazis to provoke and try to instigate violence at the anti-government protests which have been going on in Slovenia over the last year and a half. So, I mean, there were cases like this, but the protesters against the government never fell for that trick, you know. It was already used before in the past, you know, so they try to repeat the same methods. I believe strongly that they are being organized by the SDS party. They are being organized, according to my personal great belief and information that I have, by none other than Jan Mahnič, who is at the moment the State Secretary for National Security. I think Darko and Talya will find it interesting to know that we have here a prime minister who spreads around quite openly and publicly neo-Nazi conspiracy theories. We have a minister of interior who refers to neo-Nazis as pearls and refers to the civil society as swine. We have a chief of police who publicly again advocates neo-Nazi conspiracy theories, etc., etc. So the situation is quite volatile. And yeah, it's true. The policeman who intervened against neo-Nazis on June 25th this year in Ljubljana, 13 neo-Nazis were arrested on that day. We will see what will happen with their cases, but 3 police officers faced a threat of being dismissed from their jobs because they intervened against neo-Nazis, because they protected public security, basically. So I'm trying to say, and I just this sentence and then I will finish, but I'm trying to say that the situation is not as bad as Talya described. But I believe, and I'm not trying to dramatize or whatever, but we are getting there. We are getting to the point where violence is going to take place. If we have now a normalization of neo-Nazism in our society, which we do, it's a process of normalization, then of course it's visibly known to everyone what are the next steps. And in Slovenia next year, we have 3 elections, and we can expect that political tensions and social tensions will go higher, will be more tense even than it is today. We need to react to this.
Okay, Darko, Serbia. What is your experience? Reading your articles, I also noticed that some of your articles refer to court cases on the attacks on some protests also in Serbia. So this clash or attacks of neo-Nazi groups on students or leftist activists or cultural workers are also quite common even today in Serbia. What are your findings about these groups?
There are increased number of far-right groups, racist and neo-Nazi groups in Serbia today. Their increase in line with the arrival of the Serbian Progressive Party in power in 2012, which allows them to act and gather freely. They are mostly aimed at NGOs, peace activities, and refugees. Lately, they have stood out in defense of convicted war criminals, mostly Ratko Mladic. Our role is crucial because the state does not deal with extremist groups. Opposition is sometimes possible, but sometimes not, because of the growing number of extremists. I report on their illegal activities, the groups on social networks they use, and even the portals, some of which are banned. Unfortunately, there is a decreasing number of free media in Serbia that write about it. I have been dealing with this topic since 2005, and I will never stop with that. The internet services service them to connect freely. Most often, these are famous and closed groups, sometimes mostly through the Stormfront network. Lately, their activists have been joined. Extremists and neo-Nazis from Europe have visited Serbia on several occasions. The media wrote about it, but the state did nothing at all. There are more and more nationalist parties in Serbia that are loyal to Russia. Most extremists were in Serbian Radical Party. Recently, there is also the Serbian Right Party, as well as the Leviathan movement. Both are full of extremists who make riots in public places and attacks ideological opponents. They even ran in the last election in Serbia. Less people in Serbia are publicly opposed to these groups. There are still more anti-fascists at public gatherings, but more and more often the police have to separate anti-fascists from extremists who oppose them. The war past, the influence of the media and the poor educational systems mostly influence young people to become extremists in Serbia. And this is shortly about this actual situation in Serbia. I worked on my cases since 2005. Some of these guys go to the jail, but only on 1 year or half year prison. And this is not enough. Something about that is today's situation in Serbia.
So we can say what we heard about Serbia and Slovenia, both mentioning ruling parties.
Yes.
Silent or open support for such groups, and not only that, we can witness that the leaders of both ruling parties, they are prime ministers of both countries, are meeting regularly and express support to each other and organize within the European Union and Europe a kind of groups of similar political leaders. So Talya, is it possible in Germany to have a ruling party with such connections, relations with neo-Nazi group to take a government on regional or federal level?
The short answer, yes. There are known connections between the far-right parties here in Germany, and in addition, in areas of Germany that are that have voted in the recent election more far-right, there is known neo-Nazi activity. There is also less, even with less of a fight against that kind of activity. There is also known, even within law enforcement, connections to neo-Nazi networks online and chat rooms. So yes, I think also in the United States, if we're looking there too, white supremacy is the greatest threat to homeland security in the United States currently. And connecting between Germany and the United States, which is what I do, it's very evident that also in government there are known politicians, even in higher places in Congress, that are connected to known neo-Nazi networks and militia groups that regularly use rhetoric and imagery on social media that expands and is influenced and grows from known neo-Nazi chat rooms and groups online and offline. And that, again, I think it comes back to this lack of accountability, this lack of why are those people who are speaking this way against minorities and using this kind of language, why are they still in positions of power? They are all still in positions of power. And that's in the United States, and that's also here in Germany. And so it's, yeah, I definitely see it growing here and being here too, just as you are all describing in Slovenia and Serbia as well. I think it's a problem that we all are facing, no matter where we are right now.
Let's go to the opposing part, just to have one round of these questions, and then to open floor for our participants, is about opposing, countering this civil society, media, journalists, academia, political groups. How powerful and active are those groups in exposing, disclosing, countering, all the way to influencing regulation, stricter laws, prosecution? Is this powerful? Is this on rise too, and international connections between these groups or not? Talya, what do you think?
I would say yes. I think we, speaking even from my own experience, survivors from Halle, we have been very active and very vocal in speaking against the narratives and the language in the media, in the courtroom. It was very evident from the very beginning in going through the trial that the law is not justice. And if we, in our tactic, our strategy in combating this violence, is forcing people to see the context, forcing them to zoom out, recognize the connections between these instances of violence globally, recognizing the language that is recurring both online and offline, the imagery that's being repurposed through memes. How is that connected to other instances of violence that we even saw decades ago? And for us, training people to see that context is our way of combating those narratives. And I can give a really strong example of the success is that in Germany, shortly after the attack in Halle, there was a second attack in Hanau. 9 people were murdered by a white supremacist who had sent a manifesto to the police. The police did not take it seriously. The police since have been exposed as being also very connected to neo-Nazi networks in chat rooms. And that was all exposed though, because of the families of the victims. And from the very beginning, the families of the victims banded together in an initiative and have connected with us from the attack in Halle with a campaign on social media, the hashtag Say Their Names, which if you know a bit more of the context there, is also connected to the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, and using the hashtag as a form of protest and fighting back. Of course, as we know, online hashtags can also be used to disseminate more hate and to inspire more hate and to bleed into more mainstream discourse, but it can also be used to counter. And so I think what I take strength from and hope from is looking, for instance, at this initiative in Hanau, and how from the very beginning, this campaign that they started, this accountability that they have been calling for vocally, loudly, has led to a point where you don't know the name of the perpetrator in Hanau because they were so successful at pushing forward the names of the victims. And I think in looking at that, it's a very strong way. Again, I think you can even look at New Zealand for as another example of how they responded in government from even a political standpoint to the attack in Christchurch, in silencing the media from using his name, knowing the background of specifically right-wing terror that is promoted and inspired online, is this concept that it doesn't matter how many people you kill, just as long as you inspire more people to go out and do those acts of violence. And so in knowing that, in silencing that voice, in silencing those names from being out, from being used, from being spread, that is a very powerful act of resistance. And so for New Zealand to have done that on a more governmental level is incredible. And in looking at that too, in Germany, for us, the survivors from Halle, that is something that we continuously call for, to erase the name, to erase the image of the perpetrator, to combat this perpetrator society that that unfortunately we live in, and to elevate the voices of victims, and the names of victims, to push back against these narratives in whatever way and with whatever tools we have.
That's right. Erik, you wanted to say something about opposing and civil society role. Do you see potential here in being stronger and more connected?
Absolutely. I would strongly advise everyone who hasn't yet to read Julia Ebner's book, Going Dark: The Secret Lives of Extremists. We have this book now translated also into Slovenian language. I will just say it how it is in Slovenian. Torej, ime knjige, naslov knjige je V temi. Izšla je prejšnji teden pri založbi Modrijan. Okay, to continue in English, Julia describes a lot of potential here for us, of course, to counter the hate, to counter the voices of hate, to counter the populism of the far-right parties and violence and paranoid, almost schizophrenic theories of conspiracy theories advocated by neo-Nazi groups and the like. But I want to be critical here as well. We need to talk openly about our side as well. Now, if we look at the, let's say, left part of society, of our respective societies, a lot of things here are responsible as well that the situation in Europe is as bad as it is. What we've noticed, or what we went through in the 21st century, is we saw that the so-called left-wing political parties, I say so-called left-wing because many of them are neoliberal in essence, so they betrayed hardcore leftist values. You know, they betrayed the expectation of voters. Now, what happened? I mean, of course, this backfired against all of us. You had public polls conducted and analysis made in many European EU countries, and the data always points to one direction. You have voters who were once voting for social democrats now opting for the far-right parties. Why? Because in a world of chronic instability, in a society where we have less and less social equality, people will cling on to whatever sense of security there is. And of course, the right wing will, or populists will benefit from this. We cannot go over and over and over these historical lessons. The very fact that we are back in this mess is quite clearly unbelievable. It shows that a human being as an individual can be a genius, can be smart, but as a group, apparently we are still somewhere on a level of sheep, and not even particularly smart sheep. But I want to give one example from Slovenia that kind of worries me, and I want to talk openly about it. I want to address it. Quite recently, very recently, dozens of NGOs and civil society associations came together and formed a platform, which in Slovenian it's called Glas ljudstva. Now, to loosely translate it into English, that would mean like voice of the people. It could also be voice of a nation, but let's say voice of the people. So for their first coming out and presenting themselves to the wider public and particularly to the media, they made a list of 10 demands, or let's say of 10 goals that they would like to either achieve or see them achieved next year when we have, like I mentioned before, 3 elections: local, parliamentary, and presidential. So the list of 10 demands or goals consists of very general and somewhat vague points like concerning freedom, democracy, rule of law, independent media, etc. I mean, all very justifiable, of course. And in Slovenia, we know the context behind every one of these terms I just mentioned. But on this list of 10 things that we need to address is not us countering and opposing, or the necessity to oppose hate speech and hate that is growing in our society like a cancer. This is not on a list. I know for a fact that it will be added to a wider list as the list continues to grow and more people are included to give their input, and we will have open debates in society, etc., etc. I am aware of this, but the very thing that the need, the necessity to oppose hate in our society was not included in the first list of the 10 most important things is, in my opinion, a very big strategic mistake. And I am surprised it came to this, because I'm not just speaking out of my room here. I had many conversations with various civil society representatives, and I thought we have a mutual understanding that this is a serious issue that we will have to deal with. And I'm not just talking about it metaphorically or ideologically. We are not looking at a sunset and like in a far future or foreseeable future. We are talking about the year 2022.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. It is a bit long, and we promised a bit shorter. I understand your point. Not only that I understand, because the Peace Institute is part of that coalition now of 70 and something NGOs, and the longer list of almost 100 demands is already published for public discussion and includes ban of hate speech, and not only then also ban of political party media and so on. But I can agree with you, it was not highlighted among first 10, which obviously reflect what you just said. Darko, in Serbia, opposing by civil society, by journalists, how strong it is. Is it connected to cross borders and so on?
People in Serbia connected in some media, only I think 2 television, 1 or 3 radio station, and this is only in some portals like Autonomia, like Južne Vesti, like I don't know, Insider Media in Belgrade and something else, and in social media too. NGOs work together, but minority social NGOs like Žene u crnom, Women in Black, and initiative of Young for Human Rights, etc., work together. But I think situation in Serbia is very bad now, because we have so much problems. We have free elections, situation in Kosovo, in Vojvodina, with situation with refugees and something else. This is reći ću na srpskom.
Yes, I will translate.
Ok, znači to su sve stvari koje idu u prilog ovim desničarskim i neonacističkim grupama koji stalno borave na ulici i ne dozvoljavaju nevladinim organizacijama i mirovnim organizacijama da praktično stave do znanja i vlasti.
There are constant social and political crises in Serbia, also deepening economic crisis, and then Kosovo issue, this and that, and these give rise to these extremist groups which feel stronger and stronger to silence voices of opposing NGOs, and they clearly appear on streets for any LGBT or women in black, anti-fascist groups protest or event. That is, as Darko said, a difficult situation for opposing them.
Mi sad imamo situaciju da se društvo polarizovalo zbog jednog murala u Beogradu na kojem je nacrtan Ratko Mladić, gde desničari ne dozvoljavaju građanskim aktivistima da se skloni taj mural. Država zvanično je protiv ratnih zločinaca i ratnog zločina uopšte, međutim policija više štiti te ekstremiste nego građane, svesne građane.
This is reflected in the very recent event when mural of a war criminal convicted at Hague Tribunal was in the city, and the anti-fascist activists and citizens in that building wanted to remove it, and there was an incident with these far-right groups, and officially the government proclaimed they are against such war criminals, but in fact, including police, they don't act to disconnect society from them.
I said something about these groups, Leviathan, other radical groups, but država kaže to su patriote, ne kaže to su neonacisti, yes. To su ekstremni desničari, mi se borimo protiv njih. Oni samo staju između antifašista i neonacista, yes. I kažu prejke, svi ste vi isti. Nećemo da dozvolimo da remetite javni red i mir.
The state, the government is considering these groups which are mushrooming, as patriotic groups, and they see them legitimate, and when they appear in the street against anti-fascists, they just put the police in between and consider them equal. That is obviously what we said, normalization.
Basically, the neo-Nazis or far-right groups, they want to, especially on the internet, they want to be hip, they want to be cool. They are using gaming references, they are using pop culture references, they are communicating with memes, etc., etc. This is all to recruit the younger generation. ISIS Al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups do the very same thing. It's recruitment. The other thing that they do, the extreme right-wing groups, they have a tactic of controlled provocation followed by strategic polarization. So they do an action that is a public action. Let's say Generation Identity members in Austria put a burqa on top of a monument of Maria Theresia in Vienna. And so it is a provocation that then aims to polarize the society so that people who are in between, who are not left or right, have to choose sides. And all of it is done so that the public or the society is being pushed to the right, to the right, to the right, okay? But if I may, just one thing, what they do when they are not being observed by the general public, Generation Identity. In Slovenia, it's being used to recruit people into the neo-Nazi ranks. So Generation Identity produced a guerrilla media manual in which they say the following: we have to attack female journalists. We have to attack particularly the young female journalists who are fresh out of the university and who are easier to break. So this is what they are doing. On the surface, they will try to say, oh, we are against Muslims because we are for women's rights, or we are for dogs, stray dogs, or we are for democracy, or when they attack us, they say we are for free speech, but they are for none of it. They are against all these values, and we should not be falling for them. They are, excuse my language, fucking neo-Nazis. Sorry.
Okay.
Ja ću da kažem na srpskom da bi me bolje razumeli, bit ću kratak. Kada smo prikazivali film koji smo uradili, mirovni film Albanke su naše sestre sa mirovnjacima iz Srbije i sa Kosova, u Nišu na projekciji su nam neonacisti, nisu nam dozvolili da emitujemo film.
Let's me translate. When we produced a film with peace groups, Albanian women are our sisters. At the presentation of the film in Niš, a city in southern Serbia, neo-Nazis stopped the event.
Tu su bile navijačke grupe, tu su bile zabranjene neonacističke grupe, bilo je svakakvih desničara. Kada smo kasnije pogledali snimke koje smo napravili, videli smo da je organizator cele te skupine bio jedan vrlo sumnjiv lik koji živi u Nišu.
And there were among them extremist group, football fans, very mixed group. And when they saw the filming of that incident, they saw a face of a very, how to say, strange person from the city as a leader of this group.
I onda smo videli kasnije da je u pitanju organizacija Srpska čast, koja služi kao neka paralelna vojska Miloradu Dodiku, i videli smo da oni imaju registrovanu humanitarnu organizaciju preko koje prikupljaju pomoć za porodice ranjenih i palih boraca u ratovima na prostoru bivše Jugoslavije.
So they recognize that this guy is in fact, and this group belong to an organization, Serbian Honor, which serve as a kind of parallel army or a kind of a squad for the political leader of Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik in Bosnia, and they present themselves as a humanitarian organization which collect humanitarian support for the families of the soldiers or victims of the war in Bosnia from the Serbian side.
I samo još jedna rečenica, posle smo napravili u jednom drugom projektu mapu ekstremizma u Srbiji sa više od 20 organizacija i verujte, sve te organizacije imaju registrovane humanitarni rad i prikupljanje pomoći slične vrste, a u suštini su neonacističke ili ili nacionalističke, ekstremističke organizacije koje deluju u Srbiji. Među njima su i članovi crvenih beretki i neretko se i slikaju, a znamo ko su oni bili i šta su radili.
So in Serbia, they mapped a map of extremist groups, around 20 of them, and all of them have registered a humanitarian activities. So getting that profile, while they are all of them extremist far-right groups, including some how to say these armed groups. When I researched the hate speech against Roma, for instance, in Slovenia, several times you can see that other ethnic minorities are sometimes even the strongest in attacking verbally or Roma and so on. So this second generation, or as Erik disclosed in his reports, that many of members of neo-Nazi groups in Slovenia are with origins of their families from immigrants' families, you know, from former Yugoslavia. That is now what you disclosed in the recent article. Does it happen in Germany also that you can see people from immigrant origin background in among these groups?
Yes, I think maybe a quick answer to that is when it comes to extremism and recruitment and radicalization, it affects every person. Any person can be radicalized, and it doesn't matter your background. In Germany, for instance, there was a racist attack in 2016 at a shopping mall in Munich. And the people who were murdered were teenagers. And the perpetrator, perhaps some of you recall this, was also from not originally from Germany. And Germany didn't call it a racist attack for a long time, which was a major mistake, because that's what it was. So I think that, you know, recognizing that anyone and everyone, that we are all responsible in speaking even to our neighbors and our family members about the language that they're using or how they are communicating or thinking about other communities is important. I also perhaps can offer a reference as well. There are some very powerful YouTubers that use the same tactics that far-right players use on YouTube to recruit. They use those same tactics to de-radicalize people via YouTube. And perhaps you're familiar with some of them, but it's one of or two of them that I often think about a lot in this conversation of how do you speak to the middle? How do you make sure that the middle isn't going further right, especially when you have people in the middle, like Sonia was mentioning, who don't necessarily equate Nazism with evil. And when they ask the left, for instance, in these certain circumstances, well, what's so bad about being a Nazi? What's so bad about it? Because they don't have that reference point. And I think on the left, we do have that responsibility of also figuring out ways of communicating what it is and what it means, and not just saying, well, Nazi is bad, but explaining why that is. And I think that's something that we are having to work on, and that's something that these players on YouTube address. The two that I'm thinking of is ContraPoints is one, and the other is Destiny. And they often, there's actually one in particular where they speak together about their strategies and how they combat far-right players on YouTube by inviting them onto their channels, by debating them, using these rational tactics and not discrediting when the middle comes to them and says, well, I think this about the immigrants coming here because of this and this. They find ways strategically, rhetorically, to then convince them that they're not against them, but that they are then helping them get to the point where they feel like they're being heard, but also understanding why what they were saying in the beginning was not appropriate and was harmful. So it's it takes a lot of thought, and it takes a lot of conversations, I think, even where we are and standing, and what does it mean to break down these narratives for ourselves in our own communities, and how do then we project that outwards to to limit how influential the far right can be.
Thank you everybody for contribution, particularly to Talya, Darko and Erik, and for all of you joining us and taking floor, just listening. Thanks. Thank you journalists also for joining us. And let's continue countering, disclosing, thinking and working in our communities. Goodbye to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.